In the heart of the harshest winter, when the winds howled mercilessly across the plains, one Amish carpenter's ingenuity would prove to be a lifesaver. With the snow piling higher and the roads impassable, he had a secret, a hidden tunnel beneath his cabin that allowed him to haul firewood unseen, his lifeline, in a world where survival meant outsmarting the storm. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if tales of quiet courage and unspoken ingenuity move you, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story might just warm your heart. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if stories of perseverance and survival touch your soul, join us for tomorrow's tale. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, somber shadows across the snowy fields. Samuel Yoder stood in his barn, the faint sound of the wind whispering through the cracks of the old wooden walls. The carpenter's work had been slow these past few days, his hands stiff from the cold. He looked out at the sprawling landscape that was now turning gray under the encroaching evening, the heavy sky threatening more snow. For most of the Amish in the area, the storm that had been forecasted was just another winter storm, one they would endure like the many before it. But Samuel knew better. In these remote parts of Lancaster County, the wind wasn't the only threat. Snowstorms came swiftly and without warning, and when they hit, they left families stranded. He could hear the murmur of quiet conversations around the settlement, the speculation on whether or not it would be a mild storm or a fierce one. His neighbors often underestimated the power of the winter. Samuel, however, had lived through enough brutal winters to understand that sometimes survival wasn't about how fast you could build a fire or how thick your walls were. It was about the quiet solutions you kept hidden, the ones no one ever noticed until they were needed most. As the evening wore on, the snow began to fall. A gentle dusting at first, but it quickly turned into thick, swirling flurries. Samuel walked to the back of the barn and opened a small, concealed trapdoor in the corner, revealing a tunnel that snaked beneath the ground. He stepped inside, the warmth of the barn fading as the cold earth swallowed him. The tunnel, hidden from the view of any curious onlookers, had been his secret project for months. It wasn't just a way to transport firewood. It was his insurance against a winter storm that could cut him off from the outside world for weeks. The storm outside might close the roads, but it would not stop him from surviving. The storm raged through the night, as fierce as Samuel had predicted. By morning, the world outside his cabin was blanketed in deep snow, the winds howling against the log walls, pushing drifts higher and higher. Most of the town would remain buried for days, their homes untouched by the wind's fury. The roads were impassable. For some, this meant no deliveries of supplies, no firewood, and no way to reach town for help. Samuel's cabin stood solid and quiet in the storm, nestled at the edge of the settlement. To an outsider, it was like any other Amish home, simple, modest, unremarkable. But behind its sturdy walls, a secret was tucked away. A few weeks prior, Samuel had stockpiled enough firewood to last through the worst of the winter. But he had prepared for more than just the basic needs of survival. The tunnel he'd dug beneath the earth, hidden by thick layers of snow, was more than just a practical solution to moving firewood. It was his safeguard against isolation. He gathered his tools and bundled up against the bitter cold. The howling wind made the journey to the woodshed treacherous, but he moved with purpose, knowing he had no time to waste. He could hear the wind battering against his cabin as he worked, the sound echoing in his ears. His breath came in visible clouds, freezing on the air. With each piece of firewood he moved, he paused to listen to the storm's fury outside. The path to the barn had already been buried, and his neighbors, those who lived just a few miles away, would be too far to reach for any assistance. As the morning passed, Samuel found himself loading up the firewood into his hidden tunnel. It was not much, just enough for a few days' worth of warmth. But it was more than what others had. He smiled to himself, remembering the way the other men had laughed at his meticulous preparations. His cabin had been the subject of mockery for its oddities, and now it was the only place that offered refuge from the storm. One by one, the firewood logs disappeared into the earth, carried by the careful hands of an Amish carpenter who had built his survival not on the strength of his hands, but on his foresight. Samuel stood in the middle of his barn, watching the snow fall outside. The storm had come as expected, and soon the town would be buried under its weight. But Samuel knew something the others didn't. When the snow melted, he would be one of the few who remained standing not just physically, but spiritually, ready to share what he had with those who had once called him foolish. By the third day of the storm, the world outside Samuel's cabin had become a frozen wasteland. The snow had not stopped falling, and the winds only seemed to grow in fury. The town of Lancaster was effectively cut off from the outside world. The nearest roads were buried under 5 feet of snow, and even the most prepared settlers were now stuck in their homes, unable to get firewood or supplies. Inside Samuel's cabin, though, the warmth was steady, the crackling fire in the hearth dancing cheerfully despite the howling wind outside. His tunnel, now proving itself to be more than just a clever way of hauling firewood, was his lifeline. Each time he ventured down into the tunnel and returned with more logs, his neighbors' voices echoed in his mind. Why all the fuss? It's just a storm. He had always been meticulous, some had said overly cautious, but now, as the storm raged, Samuel was the one who had the luxury of peace. It wasn't long before others began to notice. Samuel had already heard the soft knocks on his door late the previous evening, but he had remained quiet, knowing that there were those who, despite their best efforts, had not prepared for the full strength of winter. By the morning of the 4th day, the storm had only worsened, and the snowdrifts outside had blocked the entrances of most cabins. The roads were impassable, no one could leave, and no one could get to help. It was Peter Johnson who came first, stumbling up to Samuel's cabin through the deep snow, his breath sharp in the cold. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion, his coat soaked through. "Samuel," he gasped. "My family. We've run out of firewood. The kids are freezing. Can you help us?" Samuel could see the desperation in Peter's eyes, the tightness of his posture. The man had been one of the many who had laughed at Samuel's decision to build a fortress instead of a simple cabin. Now, his eyes were full of regret. But Samuel was not one to hold grudges. He nodded calmly, stepping aside to let Peter inside. The warmth in the cabin was immediate. Samuel watched as Peter looked around, taking in the sight of the warm fire, the well-stocked shelves, and the steady, glowing lamp. There was no sense of discomfort here. The storm outside may have been brutal, but inside, it was a different world, a world where foresight, hard work, and humility had made all the difference. "I've got plenty of firewood, Peter," Samuel said quietly. "Stay here for as long as you need." He stepped to the side and waved Peter toward the fire. "I've got enough for my own family, and then some." Peter stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the storm and his own pride weighing heavy on him. Then, with a deep sigh, he took off his coat and moved toward the warmth, grateful but silent. Soon, Peter's wife, along with their children, stumbled into the cabin, shivering and exhausted. Samuel quickly built up the fire and showed them to a small corner where they could sit and warm themselves. There was nothing flashy about what Samuel had done, no grand gestures, no show of heroism. It was simply a quiet offering, the simple grace of knowing how to survive in a world that often felt too big and too harsh. That evening, Samuel sat by the fire, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes reflecting the glow of the flames. As he looked out the window at the storm still howling outside, he felt no pride, no sense of, "I told you so." Instead, he felt peace. A peace born from the quiet confidence that when others had looked away, he had stayed true to his instincts and his faith. And now, that quiet preparation was offering not just survival, but sanctuary. By the end of the week, the storm had not relented. The howling winds showed no sign of stopping, and the snow continued to pile higher, trapping everyone in their homes. Samuel's cabin had become a small refuge for a handful of families who had found their way to his door. His tunnel, a well-kept secret until now, had been a silent hero, ferrying firewood and provisions from the barn below the earth to keep the hearth warm and steady. But as the days wore on, it became clear that Samuel's foresight had been more than just a practical decision. It had become a lesson in humility for the men and women who had mocked him. One by one, the neighbors came to him, their pride crushed under the weight of their circumstances. There was William Crawford, who had once questioned Samuel's decision to build such a fortress, now standing silently in the doorway, his face gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. "I didn't think it would be like this," he said softly, his voice cracking under the weight of his words. "I thought we were prepared. I thought we could get by." Samuel said nothing. He didn't need to. The storm had already answered that question for them. All around the settlement, homes had been flooded with snow, firewood had run out, and people were struggling to stay warm. Many of the homes that had been built too quickly, with too little foresight, were now crumbling under the weight of the winter. But Samuel's cabin stood firm. By the time the storm began to break, Samuel had given shelter to nearly a dozen families. As the skies cleared and the winds finally began to die down, the neighbors who had once ridiculed Samuel stood in awe of what he had accomplished. His cabin, his tunnel, his careful preparation, these were the things that had saved lives. There were no grand speeches, no loud proclamations of victory, just quiet understanding. One morning as the snow began to melt, Samuel stood outside, his hands resting on the wooden frame of his cabin. The sun peeked through the clouds, casting soft light over the snowy plains. William Crawford came up beside him, his face weathered but sincere. He cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "You were right," he said, his words almost a whisper against the soft sound of the melting snow. "I was wrong to doubt you. What you did, it saved us." Samuel nodded, his gaze still fixed on the land ahead. "It wasn't about being right, William. It was about being ready for what could come, even if no one else saw it." There was a long silence before William spoke again. "I'll tell the others. Tell them the story, the right way, the way it happened." Samuel gave a small, humble smile and nodded. There was no need for more words. The lesson had already been learned. It was a lesson in humility, in listening to one's instincts, and in the quiet strength that comes from preparing for the worst without expecting any recognition. As Samuel turned to go inside, he could hear the soft sounds of his neighbors moving about their homes, chopping wood, clearing snow, beginning to rebuild. They had survived, but more than that, they had learned. And that was all Samuel had ever hoped for. By the time spring arrived, the landscape had transformed. The snow that had once smothered the land in a thick, unyielding blanket now melted away, leaving behind a muddy, fresh canvas. The thaw revealed the toll of the storm-frozen livestock, abandoned homes, and the lingering silence of neighbors who hadn't made it through the hardest winter of their lives. But Samuel Yoder's cabin, nestled at the edge of the settlement, stood tall and firm, just as it had when the storm raged against it. The men who had once mocked Samuel's preparations now worked side by side with him, rebuilding their homes and sharing stories of how they had weathered the storm. The tunnel that had once been Samuel's secret, a quiet tool for survival, was no longer hidden. It had become a symbol of foresight, a testament to his quiet courage and wisdom in a time when many had assumed that simple, quick solutions were enough. Samuel didn't ask for gratitude, and he never spoke of the storm again. He continued his work as he always had, measuring wood, fixing tools, and caring for his farm. But the legacy of his tunnel lived on. Whenever the winds began to pick up, and the first signs of winter loomed on the horizon, the townspeople would stop by his cabin, not for shelter, but to ask for advice. They would sit around his hearth, sharing a quiet meal, and Samuel would offer only gentle words, teaching them what he had learned. That survival was not just about strength, but about patience, humility, and knowing when to prepare for the unexpected. One evening, as Samuel sat by his fire, an old neighbor, William Crawford, came to visit. He had spent the day fixing his barn and rebuilding his cabin with the knowledge he had gained from Samuel. "You?" "No," William said, his voice steady. "I didn't just learn how to build a cabin during that winter. I learned something more important. I learned how to live even when the world wants to break you." Samuel looked up, a faint smile tugging at his beard. "It's not the world that breaks us, William. It's our failure to prepare for it." With those simple words, Samuel Yoder returned to his work, his legacy quietly living on in the people around him, those who had learned that, sometimes, the most powerful thing one can build isn't a structure, but a way of life rooted in foresight, faith, and community. The tunnel may have been hidden, but its lessons would endure forever.